Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of season 5 of The Sopranos. Now, this is not really a bad season, but I would say it's one of my least favorite seasons of the show. This is a season that definitely has some bright spots, definitely has some elements about it that I really liked, has some great episodes, but as a whole, I didn't enjoy this season as much as I did the previous seasons. So I would say this season in particular is really when I feel the show starts to take a bit of a dip in terms of quality, but that's just me personally. And the thing is, this show is so good that even though it takes a little bit of a dip, it's still better than most shows, and it's still firmly above average. Now, before I go any further sharing my thoughts on season 5 of The Sopranos, I want to give a special shout out yet again to Shine for requesting this review. And if there is another TV show, film, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to either my PayPal or to my Patreon. Link to both is in the video description down below, and I'll try to get to your requests as soon as I possibly can. Now, the main cast is the same from the previous seasons for the most part. You got James Gandolfini as Tony Soprano, Lorraine Bracco as Jennifer Melfi, the therapist, Eddie Falco as Carmela Soprano, Michael Imperioli as Christopher Moltisanti, Dominique Cianci as Corrado Jr. Soprano, Stephen Van Zandt as Silvio, Tony Sirico as Paulie, Robert Eilers as Anthony Soprano Jr., uh, Jamie Lynn-Sigler is Meadow, Drea De Matteo is Adriana, Ida Turturro is Janice, Stephen R. Shrippa is Bobby, uh, Vincent Curatola is Johnny Sack, John Ventimiglia is Artie, and of course Catherine Narducci is Charmaine, and Steve Buscemi, who is a newcomer for this particular season, who is Tony's cousin, Tony Blundetto. You also have, Dan Grimaldi, who's back as Patsy, uh, Sharon Angela as Rosalie, um, Joseph R. Ganascoli as Vito, uh, Frank Vincent as Phil Leotardo, and a few other actors and actresses. Robert Loggia is in this as Feech LaManna for a handful of episodes. You've also got Tim Daly, who has a small role in one of the episodes in this season. When it comes to the performances by the cast, I mean, for the most part, when it comes to this season, I think everybody is really on point and picks up where they left off with season 4. Uh, in particular, Eddie Falco once again is fantastic. So is James Gandolfini is Tony Soprano, Lorraine Bracco is Jennifer Melfi. Um, Dominic Cianci is really great in this as Junior, because this is the season when he really starts to deteriorate mentally, and he really showcases that in a very believable and genuinely sympathetic fashion. Like you honestly start to feel for Junior after a certain point, because he's starting to lose some of his mental faculties. He's starting to forget things, and on top of that, like he's so bored with his life that he's going as far as to go to all these different funerals just so he can get out of the house. And he did really showcase a certain tragic aspect of his character in a very solid way. I also feel, Michael Imperioli was incredible yet again as Christopher Moltisanti, and really want to give props to Ada Turturro as Janice. She was only in it for 6 episodes, but man, did she really make an impact with the 6 episodes that she had. And Drea De Matteo is Adriana. Like, this features definitely, in my opinion, arguably her best acting in the entire series. Now, Steve Buscemi, on the other hand, I like Steve Buscemi as an actor. And there are portions of his performance in this season that I do like, but I don't really feel he was the right casting choice. I don't think he was the right fit for this role. And so it just turns into a performance that I'm just kind of mixed on, to be perfectly honest. I liked Robert Loggia, but the thing is, Robert Loggia apparently was uh, so much of a problem on set in terms of remembering his lines that his character had to ultimately be written out of the show after a certain point. And that's really a shame because I think Robert Loggia does a good job with the episodes that he's in. But apparently he was at the point in his life when he was struggling with his own mental faculties, and that was really providing a lot of issues for the production. And it's a shame, it really is. And I think it did turn out to be like one of his last major roles in anything, to be honest. Because I believe, after his appearance in this season, like, he did act in other stuff, but not really to the same capacity in terms of like being a major role, playing a major role in things. He was just doing voiceover stuff for cartoons and different shows and doing a lot of direct to video movies, which is really a shame. But it is what it is. Now, the story of season 5, it mainly focuses on a handful of different subplots. So you pick up where the last season left off, with Tony and Carmela separating, and so you deal with the fallout of that and how both of them um, adjust to their separation, and how the family adjusts to it as a whole in terms of AJ and Meadow. And there's also a power struggle that's going on between the New York and New Jersey crime families because Carmine passes away. Uh, there's a lot involving these prominent members of the DeMeo family and Tony Blundetto and Feach LaManna, who got released from prison, and how they reintegrate themselves into society and into the family. And the Lupertazzi family also has a bunch of people that get out of prison at the same time, including Phil Leotardo, who becomes a major villain in the series, and a genuine thorn in Tony's side. And of course, you have a lot of the stuff involving Christopher and Adriana and their upcoming wedding, and Adriana uh, struggling with the reality of being this FBI informant, and it causing a lot of issues in her life. And then there's also Junior Soprano, who's struggling with his health, and there's just a lot of things in this season that really start to show the cracks. Really starts to show that, okay, we are near the end of the line when it comes to these characters and when it comes to this series, because it is definitely a darker season. There's definitely a lot more heavy emotions. There's definitely a lot more heavy subplots and plot lines in it, and it's a season that is tonally different than some of the previous seasons. And I think for some people, that's something they really love about it. But for others, it's a reason why they're kind of cold on this season at points. And it's not, in my opinion, a terrible season. I don't think it's the worst season of the show, but I do think, in all honesty, it's definitely one of the weaker seasons of the series. As usual, I'm not really going to be talking that in depth about the quality of the direction of the episodes, the editing, other elements of the production, like cinematography or anything like that, unless I feel that it's something that I really felt was very noteworthy or worthy of praise. So let's get into a little more in depth of a breakdown of each episode. So the first episode, the premiere episode of season 5, is called "The Two Tonys." This one is directed by Tim Van Patten and written by Terrence Winter and David Chase. And this is, in my opinion, a pretty solid, pretty decent premiere. It definitely opens up with a lot of intrigue, with it taking place 10 months later, after the events of season 4, and with the release of a bunch of members of some of the other crime families who have been in prison for 2 decades. And Carmine is having health issues. He ultimately winds up having a stroke pretty soon after these mobsters are released from prison. Christopher and Paulie get into a petty spat over dinner bills. But in all honesty, the way things are set up, you genuinely do. You really do feel for Christopher with all this, because you're like, hey, yeah, you know what? At this point, Paulie, you should be paying for some of the dinner bills, because Christopher is really, he's a made man, and he's in a lot of ways Tony's right hand man. He's doing all this extra shit. He's been doing this for long enough. He shouldn't have to pay for all your damn bills anyway. And of course, they're not willing to see eye to eye yet until shit hits the fan. And shit hits the fan with this waiter who was like, hey, you didn't give me a high enough tip for this big ass dinner that you ordered. What the hell? And it leads to Christopher throwing a brick at this guy's head, and then Paulie killing the poor guy, and then taking the money that they gave him to pay for their dinner. And I'm like, wow, these guys are assholes. And that's the point. They've always been assholes. They've always been scumbags. But this season, I think, is really making that very clear. If not abundantly clear, that Christopher and Paulie and everyone who is a part of the Soprano family or a part of these mob families, they're not to be idolized. They're not to be looked up to. They're not to be cheered for, or people that you're on their side. They're a bunch of selfish uh, assholes who don't give a shit about you. They will throw a brick at your head and shoot and kill you if you dare to ask them for a higher tip. Um but after all of that, Paulie and Chris, they wind up patching things up between the two of them, and they agree to split the bill. Tony, he's now living in his mother's house, and because Carmela is no longer in his life romantically, and she's decided to separate from Tony, Tony decides to try to find another woman to replace Carmela, and he puts his sights on his therapist, Jennifer Melfi. But she doesn't want anything to do with him. Um, and that understandably upsets Tony, because he doesn't understand why anyone wouldn't want him. And so he starts asking her questions about why she doesn't want to be with him. Then she gives him an answer, but he doesn't like what he hears. And then there's also this subplot going on with this bear. that just started showing up in the Sopranos' backyard. And Carmela's understandably freaked out by this bear and calls for help. One of the actors who plays one of the fish game and wildlife guys who comes over to the house to try to deal with the bear. It's actually Robert John Burke, who was in RoboCop 3 and Thinner. I thought that was kind of interesting, kind of a fun little bit of casting to see Robert John Burke in that role. And Tony has one of his guys come to the house and watch uh, uh, over Carmela and the kids uh, while the bear is there. And Tony decides to take over the job of being a watchman for the bear by the end of the episode. So he decides, nah, you can go home. I'll watch for the bear. And in a lot of ways, the bear represents Tony Soprano, and I liked that. I felt that was some nice subtext when it comes to the screenplay. That despite the fact that Tony is broken up with Carmela and he's not a part of her life in the same capacity as he has been before, he's still roaming around. He's still there. He's still terrorizing her. He's still threatening her, even though he's not a part of her life in terms of them being together as husband and wife. So I definitely feel that was a pretty strong opening episode. Episode 2 is called Rat Pack. This one is directed by Alan Taylor and written by Matthew Weiner. And this one introduces another FBI informant, this guy who I think was involved with the real estate deal or the construction deal with Tony that enabled him to get some extra cash in one of the earlier seasons. Uh, and this guy tries to sweeten Tony up by giving him a painting of the Rat Pack, but Tony thinks that's suspicious. So then he does some digging, finds out that he's an informant. So then he has the guy whacked. Carmine, at this point, he actually passes away. Now this leaves a power chasm that needs to be filled, and it leads to a feud between Johnny Sack and Little Carmine in terms of who's going to take Carmine's place in the Lupertazzi family. Um, Tony Blendetto, Tony's cousin, he gets released from prison, um, and he's cracking jokes about Tony's weight and doing other things, but Tony still loves him. He offers him a place in the business, but Blendetto is actually trying to turn a new leaf. He's actually trying to get a legitimate job and earn an honest living, which is a nice change of pace, and it was interesting. And it definitely made his character, in my opinion, a lot more captivating than he ultimately would be later on, because it gave you a character that you could actually connect with a little bit more as somebody who's not a part of the mob life, who's not, in the business in that regard. So you could be like, hey, I want to make an honest living. I want to do all these things. I want to, get a good job. You can see a lot more of yourself in somebody like Tony Blendetto. And so you definitely really grew to like him and you started to root for him genuinely because he's willing to take the chance and he's willing to go out there and try to make an honest living. And the wives, they have a movie night. One of the movies I think they watch is Citizen Kane, which I'm like, wow, that must have been a snooze fest. In fact, I think there's a shot where one of the wives is actually like asleep. And I'm like, yeah, that's the most realistic portrayal of what it's like to watch Citizen Kane that I've seen. Um, And then they try to delude themselves into convincing each other that it's a great movie, but you could tell that a lot of these wives were like, "Yeah, that wasn't that great. That wasn't one of the greatest movies ever." Um, so I enjoyed that because I think Citizen Kane is massively overrated. It's not a bad movie. It's a film that I do appreciate a lot for what it did for cinema in terms of different camera techniques and other filmmaking uh, uh, marvels and inventions. But it is by far one of the most overrated films in my opinion because it's consistently called the greatest movie ever made by a lot of critics or one of the greatest movies of all time, and it's not necessarily because of the quality of the script, characters, or any of his other stuff. It's because of its influence on cinema in terms of camera techniques. And I'm like, that's not enough of a reason for me to call a movie the greatest movie ever. So like it was nice to see a little bit of a jab at Citizen Kane there. And this is where there's a bit of tension with Adriana because Angie never comes around, and Adriana talks about that. And then Rosalie explains why because her husband is an informant, and because of that, she's no longer invited. And that almost causes Adriana to spill her guts right then and there about her being an informant, but then she just leaves the room. And then she talks with her informant later, gives them some detail about some friend that was flirting with Christopher, who was doing something on the side. And that's the end of that episode. Not, in my opinion, a great episode by any means. There were some things that I kind of didn't mind and kind of liked, but definitely, in my opinion, one of the more forgettable episodes of season 5. Now, episode 3 of season 5 is Where's Johnny? And this one is directed by John Patterson and written by Michael Callio. And this was a better episode to me because this is where you get to see more of Feach, who was released, and he wants to get more of a piece of the pie. So he winds up beating the crap out of this local gardener because he's trying to take this guy out so he can give his business to his nephew, and then he can take some off the side of his nephew's business. Well, because this guy does Paulie's Ma's lawns, Paulie is not happy, so he beats up Peach's nephew in retaliation, and eventually Pauline Feach via Tony. They make a deal. They decide to split the territory in half. And it's such a petty, ridiculous beef, but it's honestly funny in a twisted way. The just how unbelievably brash both of these men are. Like in broad daylight, Feach will just go in and just beat the ever loving shit out of this gardener in the middle of the suburbs, and then Paulie will do the same with Feach's nephew's crew, and it's. I think it's definitely intended to be somewhat comedic because it's just so over the top, and you also have something going on with this female loan shark who works for little Carmine, who is intimidated by Phil Leotardo and his brothers, uh, or his brother Billy and Joey Pepperelli. And when this is brought up to Tony and to everyone else, in the different families in a meeting, things ultimately don't get resolved though, because Christopher, who was brought to the meeting, starts speaking out of turn, which causes Johnny Sack to storm out before they're able to uh, ultimately make an agreement or resolve things. And I really feel for Christopher at this point. I sympathize with him to a fault though, because he's a bad guy. I mean, he already like he threw a brick at a waiter earlier, and was just implicit in this guy in the waiter's murder for him just daring to ask for a higher tip, and he's also a wife beater. So yeah, the guy is in a lot of ways a piece of shit. But when it comes to everything that's going on with him and the way that he's being treated by these other mobsters, yeah, I feel for him because he's been a part of this business for a while now. He is a made man. He is essentially Tony's right hand man right now, and he can't speak at these meetings. He can't have his own conversations with these other capos or these other guys. He can't feel like he's an equal to them. That's bullshit. So I definitely do feel for him when it comes to that. This is the episode 2 where Junior really starts to fall apart mentally. He repeats to Tony that he never had the makings of a varsity athlete. Of course, that pisses Tony off, and Tony then now he has a genuine issue with Junior to the point where he cuts him off entirely. Junior winds up driving to Newark. He goes to some church trying to find Tony's father, who's been dead for years. He winds up wandering around, and the police ultimately find him, and they bring him back to Janice. Uh, Janice and Tony then get into a verbal confrontation about who's responsible for taking care of Junior. That turns very physical to the point where Tony almost chokes Janice out. And then Tony, he finds out from Junior's neurologist that Junior's not doing well, that he's had several infarcts. And then Tony decides to make things up with Junior. And it leads to a very somber, very sad scene with Junior and Tony sitting together on the couch, and Tony having this heart to heart with Junior and telling him, "Don't you love me?" And then they sit there and they get all emotional. And I thought that was a great scene. And that definitely elevated this episode. Made it one of the better episodes of this season. And honestly, that moment between Junior and Tony is honestly one of the best moments in the entire show. So, episode 4 is called All Happy Families, and this one is directed by Rodrigo Garcia and written by Tony Kalem. And this is in a lot of ways an AJ centric episode. That's usually honestly not a good thing. So this is one of the weaker episodes of the season, if you ask me. So AJ is struggling with his grades at school again. So Tony and Carmela get into another argument about it. Carmela, because she's honestly been driven to the breaking point with AJ, it is bullshit. She decides to take out her frustration on Tony and tells Tony that he has no real friends and that his men laugh at his jokes out of obligation. And Tony decides to test this later and then finds out that Carmela was correct because his men are laughing at a joke that's not even that funny. So that was a really nice bit of psychological warfare on Carmela's part. And Feach is continuing to go completely out of line, doing his own thing, and he's gone too far at this point. He's decided to steal a bunch of cars from the wedding of an associate of Tony's, and Tony is like, all right, enough is enough. He also sees that Feach did not laugh at his joke, so he sees that he's not even willing to laugh out of obligation. So he sees that Feach is definitely a threat. So he decides to have Christopher set Feach up with a bunch of stolen TVs. And then Feach gets arrested and then sent back to prison. Now, Feach was initially supposed to be a much bigger part of this season, but Loja's issues with dialogue made it so they had to change course. They had to go into a different direction send Feach to prison in this episode, and then shift the focus to Blendetto and the whole feud between Little Carmine and Johnny Sack. And I honestly wish we would have gotten the original plan for this season, because the way that things started out with this season, it seems like it's really setting up old versus new. Old mob versus new mob. Old mob boss and Feach versus the new mob boss and Tony Soprano. The old ways versus the new ways. And I think that would have been really great. It would have been awesome. And definitely would have made this one of the better seasons instead of one of the weaker seasons, because the whole focus on Blundetto is very clearly and obviously forced. And you could tell that it's a plan B. And it honestly is a shame. And it's definitely, in my opinion, more than a little disappointing, because the Feach character was established really strongly. It felt like he was going to be a really good foe for Tony to face, and then he's just gone. And now we're stuck with his cousin and the stuff with Johnny Sack and Little Carmine, and that's just not as interesting to me and not as compelling. So that honestly, that genuinely put a bit of a damper on this season. Now, after Feach is sent to prison, Lorraine, the loan shark for Little Carmine, she winds up getting murdered by Peeps and the Leotardo brothers in a very visceral and violent scene that shows that, hey, it's not just the boys that get brutally murdered and slaughtered in this business. The women also get it too. And Tony, he decides to send an apology gift to Melfi to try to get back on her good side. It doesn't work. Carmela allows AJ to go to a concert in New York, but instead he gets high with his friends in a hotel room. His friends shave off his eyebrows and write shit on him while he's passed out. These aren't friends. These are guys who are just trying to get high, and they just are roping you along. They don't give a shit. They don't really care about you. And that's a reoccurring theme throughout this episode, that people who you think are your friends really aren't. And it's not something that is just related to Tony and his crew. It's also related to his son AJ. But because of everything involving him disobeying his mother, lying to her, and all the stress that Carmela dealt with in terms of worrying and wondering where AJ was for so long, until he just decides to show up one night. She's had enough and sends AJ off to live with Tony. Carmela then decides to have lunch with AJ's guidance counselor, Robert Wegler, and they start to hit it off. And you definitely get the sense that they might be an item going forward. And then the episode ends with Carmela going back to the house and seeing how empty it is, which is honestly a great representation of empty nest. So, even though it was an AJ centric episode and it wasn't one of the better episodes of the show or the season, it still got its merits. I will give it that. Now, episode 5 is called A Regular Around the Margins. This one is directed by Alan Coulter, written by Robin Green and Mitchell Burgess. And this is, in my opinion, is a pretty decent episode. It's definitely an episode that has a lot of drama in it, and features, in my opinion, some very effective moments. So it starts out with Tony having a mole removed that turns out to be skin cancer. So of course that makes him a little wary, a little leery about life and in general, and so on and so forth. He has a very sexually tense and awkward moment with Adriana, the crazy horse, but he doesn't really go forward with it. He talks to his therapist about it in terms of how he wanted to actually uh, fuck Adriana. Like, he really wanted to take her to bed, but he understood that that would be bad for everyone involved, especially Christopher. But that night, he decides to take Adriana to go buy some coke, and he winds up in a car accident with Adriana because Tony tries to avoid hitting an animal in the middle of the road, and then the car flips over, and Adriana winds up with a neck brace and gets all beat up in the hospital. And now there's all these jokes that are spreading throughout the crew and rumors about how the accident happened. And the rumors are that Adriana was sucking Tony's dick. Christopher learns about this joke because Vito jokes about it and then almost gets into a fight with Vito. And then he goes home and beats the shit out of Adriana. And then he relapses on drugs. He goes to the bada bing with a gun, ready to kill Tony. Tony and his men, they grab Christopher, put him in a van, take him into the middle of a field somewhere, in the middle of nowhere, about ready to shoot him. But Blundetto actually comes up with a very clever idea to have Chris talk to this doctor who treated Tony the night of the accident, who then explains that Adriana's injuries indicate that she was sitting upright. This satisfies Chris, but he's still pissed off about all the guys who believed in the rumor to begin with. And I love that. I love that it showed Blundetto finding a way to resolve the situation by thinking on his feet and using his intelligence and his smarts. That was really nice to see. And Tony goes back to Melfi and he talks about how he might as well have actually went through with it with Adriana. Tony, Chris, Adriana, and Carmela, they decide to go to dinner together to put on this facade that there's no issues between them so that everybody in the family can, see that everything's okay, so they can put out some of the fires that have started to build up at this point. And that causes Vito and Chris to patch things up. And it also sets up, in my opinion, a precursor to what's to come with Tony and Carmela later on in the season. So this is a decent episode. I don't think it was a great episode, but it was decent. I definitely think it was a step up from episode 4. Episode 6 is called Sentimental Education. This one is directed by Peter Bogdanovich and written by Matthew Weiner. This is an episode that starts out with Tony being fed up with AJ's bullshit and then sends him back to Carmela because Tony and AJ keep arguing about stupid shit like cereal. And this is where Carmela and Wegler really start to get serious with the relationship. And she then goes to confession and confesses to Father Phil, about her relationship with Wegler. And Phil's trying to pressure her to go back to Tony, but she ignores him. Wegler then winds up pressuring one of AJ's teachers to give him a passing grade on a paper. And then he puts 2 and 2 together that Carmela's using him. That leads to him leaving Carmela. And now she feels guilty about it. And winds up talking to her father about how her motives will always be questioned as long as she's Tony's wife. So that's really where the veil starts to get lifted for Carmela, and she starts to realize things. But in all honesty, I felt for Carmela here because she really didn't do anything. He just decided to do it. Although she did bring it up, but at the same time, the teachers are being dicks anyway. It's even revealed that they were giving him lower grades because he's a soprano. And I could relate to that very much and very strongly because I had a teacher in high school who would do that same shit. He would give me the same grade. I think it was like a C. He would always give me a C, even when he would write on the paper saying, hey, this is the best one yet. But then it would still be a C. So, like, I can definitely relate to that. and how bullshit that is that some teachers pull that fucking crap. So, yeah, I mean, I don't really feel that it was necessarily the wrong thing, and I don't think that Wegler was out of line. In fact, the teacher who was continually giving AJ these lower grades was the one that was out of line. But that's just me personally. Um, Blundetto and his employer at the laundromat, they initially seemed like they weren't getting along, but then they start to respect each other. And then it gets to the point where one morning, his boss calls him into the office and then says, "Hey, I like you. And I heard that you want to start your own business. You want to start a massage parlor. Well, um, I'm going to help you with that. You get your massage license, and I will help you fund the money necessary to get this a massage parlor up and running. Just got to run it with my daughter. But yeah, I like you and I want to give you this opportunity." And it just seems like everything is really going Blundetto's way. Like it's really definitely seeming like he's going to actually be able to do this. He's actually going to be able to turn this new leaf. He's going to be able to earn an honest living and move past his past as a uh, criminal, as a member of organized crime. And it seems like, his luck just keeps getting better and better because he finds a bag of money that was discarded by a bunch of drug dealers. But then you start to see that maybe things aren't really going to turn out that well because he gambles most of it away. You start to see his connection and his relationship with his wife start to deteriorate. You start to see him showing signs of frustration and him not being able to handle the pressure of running his own business. And this is after he passes the exam, by the way. So he's passed the massage parlor exam. He's got this opportunity to run and operate this massage parlor business with his boss at the laundromat. But the stress is ultimately too much. And it boils over when his boss shows up unannounced one night when he's struggling, trying to get the place ready for opening. And the guy is being a bit blunt, a bit forward in terms of what progress is being made in terms of the opening and reminding a Blundetto about when the opening is. And Blundetto just cracks. He goes back to his old ways. It beats everything shit out of his boss. And then he goes back to Tony in the end and asks him about that job that Tony offered him earlier in the season. And it's such a sad moment in the series because, like I said, I genuinely was starting to root for, and I was really on Blundetto's side. I wanted him to make it work. I wanted him to get his massage parlor license and take that opportunity that his employer offered him and run with it and start a new life and earn an honest living. And he blows it. He had the chance of a lifetime, a chance that very few people get, especially ex-cons, and he blows it all away in the end. And he goes back to becoming a mobster, a cog in the wheel of organized crime. So, in my opinion, that's a pretty solid episode because of just the fall of Blundetto alone. Episode 7 is called In Camelot. And this one is directed by Steve Buscemi and written by Terrence Winter. And I like this episode, but I don't love it. There's a subplot in it that I really liked involving Christopher and this guy named JT Dolan, played by Tim Daly, who is a screenwriter that he met in rehab. And Christopher and JT, they start hanging out again. JT winds up getting invited or essentially asks to be a part of a card game. And he winds up racking up a lot of debt. And Chris ultimately realizes that he was lying to him, that he was high, that he was not clean, and that pisses Chris off. So he actually beats the crap out of JT. But because of everything that's going on with the gambling debt, and because of JT going back on the drugs, and because of the fact that JT did actually help Chris when he was in rehab, Chris feels for him and he works out a deal with him for the debt and then sends JT back to rehab. So I like that, even though it was a kind of repetitive because the whole stuff with this friend of a member of the Soprano family who got racked up a big gambling debt and can't pay it. It definitely reminded me of Robert Patrick's character and the whole arc with his character in one of the earlier seasons. So there's a bit of recycling going on there, but the connection with Christopher I liked, and it kind of it helped flesh Christopher out a little bit and showed that there were some actual bonds that he formed in rehab. And this is also the episode where Junior he he's just so bored with being stuck in the house that he decides to go to all these funerals just so he can get out of the house. But ultimately, going to all these funerals really starts to hit him hard because he starts to really feel how depressing his existence is right now. That he's got no purpose in life, and that his life is depressing because he's going to all these funerals just to get out of the house. And I felt that was some really effective drama. And then you have those two subplots which are really strong, and then you have this other subplot which is really not very good. It deals with Tony and his father's old Kamare, who had some money that was supposed to be given to her by Hesh and Phil, uh, that her boyfriend, Tony's father, entrusted to her, but she never got it. So then Tony decides to get the money and give it to her. But throughout the whole process of spending more time with this older woman, he then realizes that she's not who she says that she is. He sees that she had his childhood dog that he thought was dead, uh, and it was a dog that his father gave to her, and he realizes his father gave away his childhood dog and then lied to him after all these years that his dog was dead. And then he also finds out that his father was with this woman when his mother had a miscarriage. And this is a moment in his life where Tony covered for his whereabouts. And I think it was also one of the times when Tony ultimately had his panic attack. And one of his first panic attacks at that moment. Not his first, because his first was earlier in his life. And he goes to therapy, talks to Melfi about it. Melfi's trying to get him to actually provide some sympathy for his mother, but he rejects that because he hates his mother and wants her to rot in hell. And that's that episode. The stuff with the Kamari was interesting to a fault, but then it got really awkward and weird and lame when she's doing a dance for Tony and singing "Happy Birthday" to you as if she's Marilyn Monroe, and it was just it was just another like helicopter character that was never really a part of any of the other episodes or anything else in the series, and then just flies away and is never heard from again. So, and there were a lot of helicopter characters in this. JT Dolan was another one. So it's not a bad episode. I do like it, but I don't love it because there's all these helicopter characters, and it's an episode that has some good elements, but then it has some stuff that's not so great. Now, episode 8 though is called Marco Polo, and this is one of the best episodes of the season. And this one is directed by John Patterson and written by Michael Imperioli. And most of this episode is really about this party for Carmela's father, this surprise birthday party. And she's trying to get Tony to go to the party, but initially she doesn't want Tony to be there because of what's going on with their relationship with one another and doesn't want things to get awkward. But her father finds out about how Tony's not going to be there and refuses to go to the party. So now Tony is reinvited. Tony comes to the party. He gives Carmelo's dad a Beretta shotgun. But there's this upper crust, upper class guest who is there at the party, and he's like poo-pooing and shitting on the Beretta, saying it's not the best because it's not exported. And then throughout all of this, Carmela then realizes that the only reason why her mother wanted Tony not to come, it was not because she didn't want people to see how awkward things were with Carmela and Tony not being together. It's because she didn't want to be embarrassed in front of her hoity-toity rich guest. And she gets understandably pissed at this point because Tony was actually a really a hospitable and a nice guest throughout the entire party. It wasn't a problem at all. And her mother gets upset and it really has an issue, takes issue with Tony because of the way that this upper class hoity-toity rich asshole reacted to things. And then Carmela rightfully rips her mom's head off and tells her off. And then Tony and Carmela and the kids, they're like in the pool and they're playing Marco Polo. The kids leave. And then Tony and Carmela wind up having sex. They have sex in the pool and then they have sex in the bed later. And it's insinuated that the sparks are still there and maybe they might get back together. Like, it doesn't seem like it's just a one-off sort of thing, a one-night stand, so to speak. And there's also this other thing going on with Blundetto and the Lupertazis and little Carmine. He's trying to get Blundetto to kill Peeps in retaliation for, Peeps killing little Carmine's loan shark. And Blundetto initially turns him down, but then he sees that Tony is living a life in the lap of luxury. He sees that he's living a life that's not anywhere near as good. He's living this life that's kind of shitty, trying to make ends meet with him and his kids, but he's struggling. He's having to stay at other people's houses. He's having to sponge off of other people, and he realizes, I can't stand this. I want what Tony has. So then he agrees to take out a Peeps, and he takes him out, but he's such a klutz that he winds up sending the car that Peeps is in right over his foot. So he then winds up limping away, and then that's the end of Marco Polo. That is, in my opinion, is a genuine highlight and a really great episode of this season. Now, episode 9, it's not as good, but it's still got its strong suits. This one is called Unidentified Black Males, and it's directed by Tim Van Patten, written by Matthew Weiner and Terrence Winter. And this has another panic attack with Tony. He has a panic attack when he starts to put two and two together when it comes to Blundetto having a limp, and then Peeps' killer also having a limp. Johnny Sack also suspects that little Carmine and Blundetto were a part of the hit, but Tony winds up covering for Blundetto when he's confronted. In therapy, Tony admits the truth as to why he gives Blundetto so much leeway, because on the night that the Tonys were supposed to commit a robbery, Tony had another panic attack after arguing with his mother. and he hurt himself, leaving Blundetto to take the fall. So that was a nice bit of character depth for Tony. Tony, he gets Meadows' boyfriend, Finn, a job at a construction site. Finn arrives to work early one day, and then he finds Vito sucking off a dude in a van. That was unexpected, to say the least. That was definitely a pretty ballsy move by the writer for this episode, and I didn't mind it. Who says that mobsters can't be gay too? I mean, that's not that far fetched to me. So Vito, he tries to coerce Finn to go to a Yankees game with him and go into him later. But Finn understandably is like, "Hey, this is weird. I think he's coming on to me." So he buffs him off. Finn, he is planning on leaving town after that, but then he gets into an argument with Meadow about it in a really cringy scene that I hated because it was just a bunch of I hated it. And then ultimately it leads to Finn proposing to Meadow because he's a simp. Like, dude, like, you're just gonna propose to her after an argument because you'd want her to stop crying? Like, simp. And Carmela, she's still trying to divorce Tony to get assets from Tony, but she then realizes really quickly that she's screwed. That she's not going to get any assets from him because Tony used his influence and his power to get all the forensic accountants and to get them under his thumb and to prevent them from taking her case. And then she comes home and sees Tony relaxing in the pool again as if everything is just back to the way that it was and everything is just back to normal. And she gets a phone call from Meadow then announcing the engagement between her and Finn. Now, episode 10 is called Cold Cuts. It's directed by Mike Figgis and written by Robin Green and Mitchell Burgess. And this one is really when Carmela and Tony are definitely starting to lean even further into getting back together. So Carmela and Tony, though, they continue to argue. They argue about Tony's actions, but when she talks to Wegler, she winds up telling him that Tony's moving back in despite having no such intention yet. That's also when I think you get this really awkward, bad transition that I don't know what the hell anyone behind this show was thinking with it. It's like a really awkward freeze frame and then a slide wipe, and it looks like shit. Chris then vents to Adriana about his jealousy of Blundetto. Adriana suggests that they start a new life somewhere, but Christopher insists that he's with Tony for life. He's not going to do that. Then you have a nice bonding moment with Christopher and Blundetto when they go to their uncle's farm to find some bodies that are buried there and move them somewhere else. And they bond, and it's nice and it's fun, but it's very short lived. But it's still a nice a bit of writing and some nice scenes and acting between Moltisanti and Buscemi. Tony, he shows up to oversee the last of that job. The Tonys then decide to start picking on Christopher's sobriety, which then causes him to break down. And that's what I meant. It's very short lived. Oh, they're bonding. It seems like they're friends. Like, no, they're it's back to how it always was when Christopher was young and the two Tonys were picking on him and ganging up on him and bullying him. Janice, she's now married to Bobby, and she winds up getting arrested after attacking a mom at her stepdaughter's soccer game, and it's such a glorious scene. It's so good. She just completely snaps and just starts beating the crap out of the soccer mom, and then gets arrested. And I love it. It's so good. It's so great. This leads to Tony demanding Bobby. I don't know what name I was trying to say there, to get her under control. And he basically insists that Janice take anger management classes, or Bobby needs to end the marriage. She actually does take the classes and she makes progress. And at the bada bing, Georgie says a remark to Tony about, you got to live for today, which causes Tony to beat the crap out of him. And then the guy goes partially deaf. And then Georgie winds up quitting. Georgie, like, man, I felt so bad for that guy. He was just Tony's punching bag for the entire show for the most part. The guy got all kinds of shit and he never deserved it and was taken advantage of and he was beat up. Like, dang. Like, go find a different outlet for your anger, Tony, than this poor guy. So Tony then has dinner with the Baccalaries, and then he sees that Janice is no longer angry at minor annoyances anymore. She's not having the same issues with her anger. So then he provokes her into attacking him. And then he leaves the dinner with a smile on his face. And you're like, wow, what a sadistic piece of shit. That's the moment where you realize, okay, Tony, he's now become his mother at this point. He's a manipulative prick. So that's not one of my favorite episodes for a multitude of reasons, because it's kind of hard to watch. But I still didn't mind it because the soccer mom beatdown was legendary. And I did like the stuff with Christopher and Blundetto, bonding, and the stuff on the farm. And I actually liked how it was willing to show Tony in such a petty and just despicable light at the end of this episode. Then you have episode 11, The Test Stream, which is directed by Alan Coulter, written by David Chase and Matthew Weiner. And I love this episode. This is honestly one of my favorite episodes of this season, and honestly of the entire series. Now, this is a very experimental episode, which does make it an episode that's very divisive among fans, but I really like this episode. It's very creative, very interesting, very well done, if you ask me. And it starts out with the Leotardo brothers. They wind up killing Greppi for his role in Peeps' death. Valentina La Paz, Tony's Guma, she winds up getting hospitalized with severe burns after she goes up in flames while she's trying to make Tony some food one night. Tony, because of everything that's going on, he decides to go and stay at the Plaza Hotel. He learns of Greppi's death. He tries to contact Blundetto about it, but Blundetto ignores his calls. Tony then falls asleep, and then he has this long, extended dream. And this dream is great. Like, it's just like a lot of the other surreal, weird, crazy dream sequences and other episodes in the show. And this one is like even more extended and even longer. And it even has callbacks to some of the other dreams throughout the series previously. And this is where I definitely want to point out the direction, because Alan Coulter did an amazing job with this episode. Visually, it's stunning, and I also want to give a lot of kudos and props to the editor for this episode. So he starts having this long, crazy, extended dream. He goes to therapy, but instead of it being Jennifer Melfi, it's Gloria Trillo, this other Guman that he had, that he winded up ultimately driving her to killing herself. He's driven by his father to the job. Tony and Carmela have dinner with Meadow, Finn, and Finn's parents, Vin Makazian and Annette Bening. And Annette Bening is just playing herself to the point where, like, Tony will even remark, like, "You're Annette Bening." It's like, "Yeah, I am." And it was just a fun, unexpected cameo by Annette Bening. Blundetto, he winds up killing Phil outside the restaurant. Tony is blamed for not stopping him. Artie rescues him from a mob chasing him. He then has sex with Artie's wife while he cheers him on. He then rides Pile Mai throughout his house while Carmela allows him to move back in on the condition that you can't bring your horse in here. He arrives in the office of his high school football coach, who criticizes Tony for taking the easy way out by choosing the mob life. As Tony tries to shoot him, his gun falls apart and he wakes up. Also, prior to all of that happening, his gun falling apart, he's also like losing teeth. And that's really disturbing, to be honest. He just starts randomly having teeth fall out of his face. Because there's like this moment with him and Carmela, which is really brilliant, where it's like he's watching the dream that he's having on the television, which is really a cool moment. It's really ingenious. And so it culminates with this confrontation with his former football coach. His gun falls apart. Chris visits him at the hotel to inform him that Blundetto killed Billy. Tony then calls Carmela, tells him that he had one of his Coach Molinaro dreams. Then they talk about her day, and that's the end of the episode. I think some people aren't very fond of it because of just how experimental it is and how it's just very outside of the normal box. But I really liked it for that reason. Now, episode 12 is called Long Term Parking. This one is directed by Tim Van Patten and written by Terrence Winter. And this is really where Adriana is ultimately, let's just say, stuck between a rock and a hard place, even more than she already is. Because there's this drug dealer whose body is found on a beach somewhere. They then connect this drug dealer to the crazy horse. Surveillance footage reveals to the FBI that Adriana disposed of evidence from the killing. She then bargains for her freedom by convincing them that Chris can be made into an informant, but he almost kills her when she tells him the truth. He eventually does agree to start a new life with her, but then he hesitates when he notices a couple that kind of resembles them at a gas station, and they're not doing very good, and that makes him really decide to call things off. Tony calls Adriana to tell her that Chris attempted suicide and that Sylvia would take her to the hospital, but instead Sylvia takes her into the woods and kills her in a very tense scene. There's just so much tension in this particular episode in terms of like what's going to happen next. Is Christopher and Adriana going to make it out? Are they going to go into witness protection? Is Adriana going to get whacked? What's going to happen? And Christopher takes her car to the long-term parking lot of the Newark airport, and Tony later finds him on heroin. Christopher tells him he's trying to cope with the pain, then Tony beats the crap out of him. Blundetto calls Tony to apologize, who tells him the truth about the night he was arrested, and then Tony has a call traced to near their uncle's farm. Which, to be honest, that whole like twist, like, oh, where is he? Where's Blundetto? Is pretty obvious. I'm surprised Tony took so long to figure it out. So Tony refuses to give Blundetto up to Johnny and Phil. He then moves back in with Carmela, promises to help her build a spec house, which enables the two of them to get back together, call off the divorce. Carmela takes Tony to the spot where she plans to build and notices that Tony looks a little troubled, but, just brushes things off. And she even like mentions it to him actually. She doesn't brush it off. It's Tony that does, because she's like, "Hey, are you okay?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm fine." But of course, deep down he's not, because Carmela is dead. I mean, not Carmela. I mean, that would be crazy, right? Adriana is dead, and Christopher's back on drugs. Blundetto, he knows where he is, but he had to lie to Johnny Sack about it. He's just realizing a lot of shit is about to go down at this point. Episode 13, the finale, is called All Due Respect, and it's directed by John Patterson and written by David Chase, Robin Green, and Mitchell Burgess. And this one, it starts off with Phil actually trying to hunt down Christopher. Tony insists to his men that he's protecting Blundetto, and that, like he would any of them, but dissent begins to grow amongst the Soprano family after Phil brutalizes Benny Fazio, who is a soldier. Tony goes to Junior for help, but he's too unfocused and mentally out of it to give him advice. Both Melfi and Silvio warn him that he's protecting Blundetto out of guilt and out of pride. This is where Tony discovers the painting of him and Pyomai that Paulie had redone. And there's a bit of a tiff between Tony and Paulie over it. Of course, Paulie insists that he had made it out of genuine respect, but Tony rips it off the wall. But looks at it a bit before he throws it in the trash. Knowing that Phil would torture Blundetto and give him a very slow death, Tony goes to his uncle's farm and kills Blundetto quickly with a shotgun, then gives Phil his location. He visits Johnny's house to negotiate peace, but just as they reach an agreement, the FBI arrives to arrest Johnny. Tony gets rid of his gun and then he flees into the woods. And then a disheveled and just worn out Tony arrives home hours later, and then Carmela ushers him inside the house, and that's the end of season 5. So I think it's a pretty satisfying finale for the most part, especially when it comes to Johnny Sack getting sacked at the end. But yeah, it's not one of my favorite seasons as a whole, though. It really isn't. I think a lot of it has to do with Blundetto. And I think if you really like Blundetto and you like his arc as a whole, then this is a really strong season. If you're not really that enamored and you're not really that into Blundetto's arc completely, then it's not as strong of a season as it is for other people. I think that's really the main thing that can make or break this season for some people. But I still liked it. I'm so glad that I saw it, and I'm looking forward to concluding this series with season 6. But anyway, thanks for watching my thoughts on Sopranos season 5, and until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.